Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Katy Glenn Bass. I am the research director at the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia University, and I'm here today with Ethan Zuckerman. Ethan is an associate professor of public policy, information, and communication at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and he is the director of the Institute for Digital Public Infrastructure there. He is also a senior visiting research scholar at the Knight Institute right now, where he is working on some of his ideas related to digital public infrastructure. And we're here today to talk about Ethan's wonderful new book, which is called Mistrust: How Losing Trust in Institutions Provides Tools to Transform Them. Ethan, welcome. Thank you so much for doing this.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, and thank you to our wonderful attendees. I'm just scanning through the names. I see a ton of old friends there, as well as folks from all over the world. And I'm just really grateful, Katy, for you providing this opportunity, and to the Knight First Amendment Institute for giving us space to have this conversation.
It's our pleasure. Yeah, it's the Zoom equivalent of a packed auditorium, which is nice. So please introduce us to your book and to your arguments. And I'll add for the audience that there is a Q&A box. You should see a button at the bottom of the screen. So at any point during this conversation, please submit questions for us. Please add your name, and we'll be looking at those throughout the conversation. Ethan, take it away.
Absolutely. And let me just also say, please feel free to tweet or share anything about this. If I don't manage to get to your question during our Q&A, feel free to tweet at me at Ethan Z, and we'll try to keep the conversation going from there. But thank you all for being here. Mistrust, over my shoulder there, is a book that came out last week. This is an awfully strange time to be releasing a book into the world. And one of the things I feel like I sort of have to explain is that I didn't mean to write a book about Donald Trump, and I didn't mean to write a book about the contemporary Republican Party. When I started writing this book about 7 years ago, Trump wasn't even a political candidate. He was this weird, washed up 1980s celebrity who'd gotten a little bit of attention for supporting the birther movement. I actually wrote Mistrust because I was running a center at MIT called the Center for Civic Media. And in the process of talking to people about civic engagement, what I ended up discovering is that the word civics is almost toxic. You say it to people and sometimes their brain turns off. And I think it's because this idea of learning how institutions work and how voting systems and balances of power work, in many cases can seem really antiquated and not relevant to the sort of students that I had who were generally very socially engaged activists. The students that I worked with knew they wanted to make change in the world, but they often felt like electing representatives and passing legislation wasn't going to be the way that it happened. Maybe it would happen through movements like Occupy. And the response to students like this is usually to say, well, they're naive, they don't really understand, they're disengaged. If we just educated them better, they would understand how the systems work. And I decided actually to try to take my students and my friends seriously and to assume that they weren't lazy, they weren't ignorant, but maybe they understood something that quote unquote very serious people didn't understand about contemporary change making. And that's what led me to think about mistrust. So back up a little bit. A lot of how we think about social change in the United States comes from the civil rights movement of the 1950s and the 1960s. And this is this remarkable period of time where public pressure is able to move the court system, the legislation, the executive, all in sort of bold steps towards a more racially just and equitable society. And many of the elders that I've had the privilege to learn from in activist movements take their inspiration, take their strategic lessons from their successes during this era. But I'm increasingly suspicious that this may not be the way to make change these days. And I think the reason is that Americans' trust in institutions has changed really radically since the 1960s. So we poll Americans every year and ask the question, do you trust the government in Washington to do the right thing all or most of the time? And in 1964, at the height of the civil rights movement, 77% of people trusted the government in Washington to do the right thing. Now, this is even at a moment where the government in Washington is radically changing a social system that's been in place for hundreds of years. They're creating equal rights for people of color. But at that moment, there's enormous trust in those institutions. So 77% 1964. Then the 1970s happen. We get the Vietnam War, we get Watergate, we get the energy crisis. By the end of President Carter's term in 1980, only 26% of Americans said that they trust the government to do the right thing all or most of the time. So we go from over 3 in 4 to just slightly more than 1 in 4 Americans trusting the government. Trust has recovered occasionally since then. It briefly crossed 50% right before we invade Iraq after 9/11. It's never gotten back there since. We haven't crossed what I call the Carter line since 2008, which is a quarter of people trusting in government. Under Obama and under Trump, you have around 17% of people saying they trust the government in Washington. That would be one thing, but it's not just the government. Through the 1970s, the 1980s, into the 1990s, trust in every institution in America, with the exception of the military, we can talk about why that is, trust in all institutions, from banks and big business to universities to the healthcare system to churches, it drops. We go as a people from being deeply trusting of institutions of all kinds to being deeply mistrustful of the same institutions. Weirdly enough, we don't actually change in interpersonal trust all that much. We trust our neighbors a little less than we used to, but it's nowhere near as dramatic as the change in our relationship to institutions. So this presents a real problem for civics. We have two basic models for civic interaction. You can kind of think of one as the electoral and one as the protest model. Either we tell people, work on a political campaign, go and vote, write to your representative, participate in the political process, put up that I voted sticker. That's how civic change happens. And like I said, we're losing faith in that, right? Congress, generally speaking, has about a 9% approval rating. Most people look at how our legislative processes work and sort of say, I can't make change that way. So the other model that we sort of celebrated is the protest model. This is the civil rights era model, but it's really important to remember that the March on Washington in '63 with King's I Have a Dream speech was a march on Washington. It's designed to force President Kennedy's hand and force Kennedy and then LBJ after him to make those changes that we get within the civil rights movement. Think about, by contrast, the massive March for Women's Rights right after Trump's inauguration. No one expects that they're going to change or force Trump's hand. It's much more an expression of frustration and rage. So this book was an attempt to look at civics from the perspective of people who are frustrated with existing paths to change. And I ended up borrowing two words from Chris Hayes, and they're terms that feel a little fraught in the wake of January 6th, but the terms were institutionalist and insurrectionist. Here's what I mean by them and how Hayes uses them. Institutionalists are people who believe that the way to change the world is by supporting the institutions that we have. You vote, you join the big bank, you join the company, you change it from within, and that sort of incremental change in the institutions is how we get there. Insurrectionists look at this and say, you got to be kidding me. These institutions are not fit for purpose. They're not working for us anymore. And we either need to thoroughly revamp them or replace them entirely. And this book is really an attempt to take insurrectionists seriously. But now I've got to put in a footnote, which is to say that the folks who violated the Capitol on January 6th are not insurrectionists in this sense. They're terrorists, very simply, right? They were trying to kill, frighten, and occupy in order to keep a leader in power despite losing an election. And honestly, I'm not especially interested in those folks. What I'm much more interested in is people who are saying, look, I don't feel like I can work in the institutions, but I'm going to take a different approach to the institution. Maybe I'm going to stand outside of the institution and try to hold it accountable. And this is a practice that a philosopher named Pierre Rosanvallon calls counter-democracy. You push against a democracy to strengthen it. Some of them are what I call radical institutionalists. They're willing to get into an institution and take it back to its original purpose. And there I actually look a lot at the DA's office in the city of Philadelphia, where you've seen this amazing reform movement of progressive prosecutors coming in and saying, we don't have to focus on putting people in prison. We can focus on justice. That's actually the core value of the institution. And what I'm really most interested in are people who are looking and saying, this is an institution that isn't working. Folks like Defund the Police, who are saying, we simply need to move beyond that institution and build back something better. So what I'm trying to do is provide a toolkit for activists that's much, much broader than the civics that we get taught, or in some cases we don't get taught in high school. And this kit does include passing laws and winning battles in the Supreme Court, but it also includes ways of making change through promoting new technology, through market mechanisms. Maybe the most powerful one, or the one that I'm most interested in, is the notion of making change through changing social norms. I think these days, changing social norms often precedes legal change. And one of the things I talk about in the book is the difference between the equal marriage decision in Oberfelge, where you see huge public support for equal marriage, as opposed to in Loving versus Virginia, where you saw almost no public support for interracial marriage, but the court stands up and says, no, this is the right thing to do. We're going to make it possible. I think we are no longer in that sort of era of activist government, and trying to bring upon the social change before the legal change is often the way to go. But the point of the book ultimately is that it's okay to be frustrated with the institutions. It's okay to be frustrated with government. It's okay to be frustrated with big business. It's okay to believe that in some cases, maybe we actually need to start from a clean slate. What's not okay is sitting on the sidelines. And so that's what I'm hoping to address with the book. The book is really for people who feel frustrated with existing modes of change, and to try to look at this way of taking mistrust in these institutions, and instead of letting it be corrosive and dangerous, which it absolutely is, channeling it into fuel for change in one fashion or another. So I realize very high level, very abstract, hard to do in 10 minutes or so. But Katy, why don't we bring you back and let's have a conversation about it, since you did the work of reading the book, and I really appreciate you for doing that.
Yes, let's. It's an excellent book. It's a great read. It pulls together so many different movements and ideas and people, and things that have inspired me personally, and I think a lot of people um, interested in the progressive side of things. But you also give us this framework for sort of how to think about what some of these people are doing, and it's a toolkit. That is also what I thought as I was reading. But there's also it's case studies, and it's also making the case that even at a moment when everything feels really broken and kind of impossible to change, and I want to come back to some of those structural problems later, there's still a lot that can be done, and there's still a lot that's already being done. So I think it's a very useful offering of hope for some of us right now at a tough moment. So thank you for that. So to start off with, I actually want to ask a fairly basic foundational question, which is, why is trust and mistrust your North Star here? What do you see as possible in a society where we've managed to restore some trust in institutions?
So I think trust ends up being socially important for a whole bunch of different reasons. I talk about it a little bit in the book in economic terms, that it's very hard to carry out a transaction if you don't trust people. And the third chapter of the book opens up with the example of the Sicilian Mafia, where a lot of scholars now believe that the reason the mafia comes into being is that there was no functional judicial system and no one knew how to do a deal. And the mafia actually begin as trust brokers. They sort of say, look, we're going to enforce this deal and sort of make sure that both sides are satisfied, and we're going to take our cut in the process. it's really hard to function an economy without trust. We saw this in the early internet before we end up with eBay, and we end up with all of these different systems like PayPal to sort of prevent yourself from being ripped off from somebody else. Trust is this sort of incredible social lubricant. The other thing about trust is that trust is basically a way in which governments sort of end up with legitimacy. And when you end up in a situation where the government has little to no trust, you can get stuck in this sort of vicious circle where there's no way to do anything. A pretty seminal experience for me. I spend a lot of time focused on West Africa. It's a place that I've lived and a place that I continue to visit a lot and have a lot of friends in. And the Occupy Nigeria protests focused on a change in fuel prices, right? So basically, Nigerians do not get a lot of public services. One thing they get is really cheap gasoline because it's an oil producing nation. The truth is most Nigerians don't benefit from this. Most people can't afford a car. So when the government says, look, we're going to stop subsidizing gasoline, we're going to spend it on schools instead, the economist in me sort of goes, well, that's great. That's exactly what Nigeria needs, functioning public schools. Instead, people went nuts. They went out into the streets and said, you're taking the one thing we get away. Why are you doing this? And what happened was the government had such low trust that no one believed that that money would go to build schools and roads. They just believed that it would end up in people's pockets. And so when you reach that point where there's just so low trust, you really can't do anything, right? You can't take something away. You can't even tax people because they don't believe that it's going to go in a good direction. I don't think we're there yet in the United States, but I think that there are forces that have tried to drive us there. And a lot of this book is sort of wrestling with these lessons from the late 70s and the early 80s, where you have Ronald Reagan essentially standing up and saying, government can't do anything right. If we can just pull it away from the government, America will be successful. It's tying a hand behind our back. We've taken one of the most powerful things we can do as a society, having a well-functioning government. And I think we're now in the era of COVID, sort of seeing just how problematic it is to have pulled back all those resources and to sort of take those tools out of our hands.
Thanks. Yeah, I was struck by that too, the way you show how politicians, and especially in some cases right-leaning politicians, have been a part of that movement to erode confidence or the belief that the government is capable of doing these things or can do these things. And in your presentation, you were also mentioning falling levels of trust from the 50s up until now. But you're not making an argument here about the good old days or things being better before. I think you address very deftly how trust for you relates to some of the US's longstanding issues like racism and high levels of inequality. So can you talk a little more about that?
Yeah, thank you for drawing that out. I think in many cases, what people do is look at these trust statistics, which are well known, and sort of say, let's get back to trusting these institutions. Let's put our shoulder to the wheel and everything's going to be great. Well, let's talk a little bit about that trust. Those institutions in the 50s and 60s weren't working well for people of color. They weren't working well for women. They weren't working well for queer people. There were lots and lots of people for whom institutions were not working well. And as we start pulling apart those numbers, we can see that trust in government is much stronger for white Americans than it is for Black or Latino Americans. So it's not a matter of sort of returning to a past where things just worked and we sort of blindly trusted them. It's possible that one of the reasons that trust in aggregate falls is racism. It's white people essentially saying, oh, geez, the government is in fact going to redistribute from me and support people who are not me to try to achieve equality in one fashion or another. I don't trust a system that does that. It's probably not the only explanation for that falling trust, but it's certainly one that we can look at. So one of the reasons why the book looks at the civil rights movement, why it looks very closely at contemporary rights movements like Black Lives Matter, like equal marriage, is that when you look at issues of trust, you always have to look at groups who do not have a good reason to trust and who have reasons to be mistrustful. That mistrust is often fuel that helps people forward. One of my favorite interviews in the book was talking with Rashad Robinson of Color of Change. And I was asking him whether he was finding that his working methods had to change under Trump. And the reason for this, of course, is that Donald Trump has weaponized mistrust to a way that no other politician ever has. You know, generally speaking, leaders come into power and sort of say, I'm going to make the government better. Trust me, this system will work out. Trump essentially said, nope, nothing works. I'm the only one who can get anything done. The rest of it is a deep state. Trust nothing, just trust me. So I asked Rashad whether this was a different landscape for him. And he said, you know, I'm a civil rights leader. I'm a Black man. Like, we've never been in a position of being particularly trusting of institutions. We've always been sort of fighting to push institutions from the outside. But this is a moment of public trust where learning from people who have been systematically disenfranchised is an incredibly source of wisdom and power for people across this political spectrum.
Mm-hmm. And I should also add, I mean, this is not just a book about the United States, far from it. I think it has a lot of lessons for activists in the United States, but you have interviews and references and case studies for movements in a lot of different countries. The Occupy Nigeria reference is one, but there's also some really interesting interludes with Indian activists and people in the global South. So I'm wondering, going back to this insurrectionist concept, which of course it's a term with very different valence after January 6th, but effective insurrectionism is one of the core ideas of your book, this idea that insurrectionism can be more than a roar of rage, that it's sort of, there's a range of strategies you can use. So tell us more about the movements or the people that inspired that concept for you and what you have in mind when you're thinking of that.
Yeah, I think the movement that's maybe easiest to understand that in terms of is what's happened in Taiwan in the last 10 years. I think many people know that Taiwan has essentially been a COVID miracle. Taiwan has a huge population overlap with mainland China. There's more than 1 million Taiwanese who live in mainland China and who go back and forth between the two. And despite the fact that you've got a population of about 25 million Taiwanese, you've had fewer than 1,000 cases of COVID, and you've had essentially zero local transmission. Taiwan often celebrates weeks with 0 cases of COVID. So that sounds like a strong, stable, maybe authoritarian government. And the answer is no, not in the least. Taiwan threw out its government essentially in 2014. There was a giant student movement called the Sunflower Movement that occupied parliament. It was a movement that tried to push Taiwan even further away from mainland China. And the people who were involved with the movement did something really interesting. When they chased out the pro-China party, many of the people involved ended up joining government. And they joined government in a really unusual way. They basically said, look, some of the things that we need to learn to do as movement leaders, we're going to have to bring into the government. So there's a minister without portfolio, Audrey Tang, and her job is citizen inclusion, usually through digital means. So there's been this really thorough digital overhaul of Taiwan where public policy debates happen in public. When you meet with Audrey, it's a little disconcerting because she records, transcribes, and posts every conversation she has with you. And so all of this seems a little bit like hype. You know, it's what happens when open source people come into the government. But it had really interesting implications when Taiwan started facing COVID-19. Suddenly you have just some citizen write an app that helps people find face masks to protect them from the pandemic. And the government says, hey, that's awesome. Do you mind if we scale that up for you? And then, you know, within a week, you have a government service telling you where to go and get face masks. I just went through the process this morning of trying to help my parents who are in their late 70s get their COVID shots. It's a nightmare. And, you suddenly find yourself realizing, oh, that's why we're not very good at this. We have no system and we have no mechanism to sort of get to it. Taiwan instead has sort of like embraced these hackers and are letting them, as they call it, fork the government. One of the things Audrey achieved, which is crazy, is you can apply for a permit to have a law not apply to your business for a year. You can basically say, hey, I want to sell marijuana. And so I would like to apply to have that, law waived for a year. And then there will be a case study at the end of the year. And if you can demonstrate that this was a net social positive, they'll go ahead and change the law. So this is a very weird way to have your sort of insurrectionists come in and sort of build the new institutions. But it is evidence that these things are actually possible. It also is evidence that it doesn't necessarily have to happen in hypermodern places like Taiwan. I actually end up talking a lot about the workers' rights movements in rural India, and particularly in Rajasthan, where people were able to use government transparency to create a right to work and literally go to the government and say, look, I have a right to have a job and to make money. And these are groups that were entirely outside the mainstream, but managed through transparency and sort of naming and shaming to thoroughly transform the government's relationship with workers. So I think while the book is very heavily rooted in the United States and our sort of unique dysfunction, because I think we may be uniquely dysfunctional for advanced democracies right now, a lot of the places that I'm finding hope are democracies outside the United States.
That's great. So one thing that jogged my memory as you were talking about Taiwan is this concept of the citizen, and the way that concept has changed over time is also something that factors into your book throughout your narrative. This idea that what it means to be a good citizen has changed over time. The idea of civic piety as something that's really not very helpful. And then I think this very related concept of counter democracy that you mentioned earlier. So can you talk a little bit about how those work together in your theorizing here?
Sure. One of the books that was most important to me in reading this is by my friend Mike Schudson, who's over at the journalism department at Columbia. Um, and Mike's brilliant, but in particular, I really commend a book of his called The Good Citizen. And Mike starts writing the book because he's a poll watcher in Southern California, and he's trying to figure out how the people who are coming in to vote, who are mostly elderly, because in most elections, that's usually who votes, um, are reading the 460-page voter guide that you need to read to vote on California ballot propositions. And he's realizing that, we are attaching ourselves to a mode of democracy that for the most part doesn't really work, right? People aren't doing that reading. People are voting straight party tickets. People are voting in ways that they're not always very well informed. And rather than wringing his hands and saying, this is horrible, Mike decides to look back through history and he says, look, this model of the informed citizen is pretty new. It comes up in the 1910s and 1920s. It's part of the progressive reforms. It's this idea that rather than political parties being literal parties where we swill beer and we all go together and we rush the polling booth because the other side is going to try to beat us up and prevent us from voting. This is the progressive movement. There's two sort of phases before that. He points out that, in the democracy of the founders, this was not politics about issues. It was really politics of character. You were supposed to choose the most honorable and most respectable and most upstanding of the local citizens to be your representative. And then, of course, it falls into that party system of there's party machinery and the candidates are going to be there and we bribe people with liquor to get them to the polls. So Mike sort of suggests that maybe this 1920s system, which has all sorts of good things to it, it's got a free and independent press, it's got private ballots, it's got this notion that citizens should be informed about this, maybe this is increasingly unrealistic. And maybe what we actually need is efficacy. Maybe we need ways for citizens to say, oh, here's where I can have an impact. Here's an issue that I'm going to monitor or that I'm going to watch very closely. And I'm going to be an expert on this. And maybe my friends will listen to me on this issue and I'll listen to them on other issues. And this is where I'm going to sort of focus my efforts. Mike and I are both fond of this French philosopher, Pierre Rosanvallon, who writes this brilliant book a few years ago called La Contre-Démocratie, which traces back French democracy and looks at the French Revolution and sort of looks at all these institutions that the revolutionaries put in place. And they essentially say, look, we've got to monitor these people in power. Democracy is not just voting, it's also holding those institutions accountable. And Rosenwald likens it to a flying buttress. That pressure from the side is what keeps the wall of the cathedral standing. And so much of what I see people doing really well right now is that contre-democracy. It's watching, it's a group like Cop Watch, which is watching for police violence and trying to document it as a way of trying to get increased accountability. I talk about my friend Luigi Reggi in Italy, who has a project called Monothon, in which citizens go out and monitor EU government spending as a way of, in the long run, increasing trust in government spending. What happens from monitoring a lot of the time is that you go out hoping to find that your institution is corrupt and to reveal that corruption. You often find that it works pretty well, and that the problems are in fact problems that it's really hard to provide services to a whole lot of people. But I think it's critically important that monitoring, that counter democracy, that sort of holding accountable is seen as much part of the democratic process as voting, as standing for office, as all of these other mechanisms that we're more used to.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, I think it is a both and, right, rather than an either or, because that, the voting question is something that I think it's interesting the way the book touches on it. And I'll note there's a question from an audience member, Susan Olds, hi Susan, who asked about the massive voter turnout in 2020 and how that, how does that play into this sort of trust or distrust theory? And then also, I largely agree this idea that the informed citizens model is probably outdated, but I think, for a lot of people, at least, I guess I'll just use my own example. I tend to vote a straight party ticket as well, but it's not because I don't know the issues well. It's because it's very easy for me to distinguish which party is the one that I want to be associated with. So how do those things interact for you?
Yeah, so I think my interpretation of the very high voter turnout in 2020 is a sense that the last 4 years in the US just strained institutions to their breaking point. I think one thing that I found so interesting is that people who I normally think of as being people who are very frustrated with systems found themselves becoming really robust institutionalists early on in the Trump presidency. You suddenly had dyed-in-the-wool Democrats, rooting for the FBI, to hold Donald Trump responsible. And, generally speaking, we don't root for the FBI. That's not really, the side of these things that we tend to be on. But when you're facing someone who's really just trying to burn down institutions in general, you have this sort of realization that we desperately need institutions. I felt this very acutely as the pandemic caught on, and we had the Trump administration essentially saying, don't worry about it, it's all going to go away. I just kept waiting for someone to tell me that it was time to stop going to work and to stop getting on airplanes. And, my employer, MIT, at that point finally sent something out around March 20. And I found myself going, thank God an institution stepped in, because there's certain decisions that are just very hard for individuals to make. So I think what happened in 2020 was a lot of people saying, I want some basic functional institutions, let's sort of keep this going. I think at the same time, we clearly have a lot of people who felt like Trump's message of mistrust everything and trust me was compelling enough that he was able to get 77 million votes. So it's hard to know with that. I think what I would read is these last 4 years have made people aware that governance, institutions, a functioning public sphere is something that we actually all have to think about, because we have been through such sort of extraordinary times at the moment. As for sort of your question about informed citizenship and, you know, the single ticket and so on and so forth, there are many, many good books that I have not written that are sort of looking at how we could overhaul the institutions of American democracy. And they're generally written by people who are much, much better at the minutia than I am. If anything, what I wanted to do with this book was to sort of suggest that we could think bigger than people normally think. And my sort of key example for that was talking about Congress. George Washington had very little to say about the US Constitution, stayed out of it, sort of felt like he didn't want to put his thumb on the scale. One of the very few things that he says during the debates about the Constitution is that we need one representative per 30,000 people. One per 40,000 is too high. We shouldn't do it. We're now at one per 770,000 people. That's a really different relationship than one per 30,000. We've stayed there for a bunch of esoteric reasons. None of them are constitutional. We actually could reapportion, and we would suddenly have what I call the big house, which would have about 11,000 representatives in it. It would have to work very differently than it works right now. It would have to be virtual. You'd have to run it on Zoom. You'd have to have sort of caucuses around it. But it'd be pretty interesting. You'd actually have a rep who lived in your community. In many cities, you'd have a rep who lived in your neighborhood. It also has the convenient effect of essentially making the electoral college obsolete. You now have so much representation proportionally that the balance of senators doesn't change all that much. And it's completely constitutional. Will it happen? No, probably not. But it's the sort of reimagining institutions by literally going back to say, what were we trying to do with this in the first place? The House of Representatives was meant to represent people and represent them in a deeply personal way with a representative they had a personal relationship with. I'm going to argue that most of the people on this call probably don't feel like they have a personal relationship with their representative, which is actually sort of what that institution was intended for. You can radically change institutions, not just by tearing them down and building something new, but sometimes by going to their very core and sort of saying, have we strayed from this original conception of it?
So the Congress example, I was also really struck by. I did not know, it's a very interesting story. You should buy the book so you can read the whole thing. I didn't realize that we had frozen apportionment at 435 House members, and I didn't realize it had anything to do with prohibition, which is also fascinating. So, but it brought me to some of the bigger stumbling blocks that I worry about with this country's future, and the issues that really feel kind of unsolvable, but you don't ignore those. So things like the Electoral College, and partisan gerrymandering, and the ways in which the political map as it is currently laid out, means that representation is not proportional, and it's not proportional in a way that favors Republicans, so they do not have an incentive to change it. So what is the case for hope there?
So I think my case for hope is that, you know, you and I hang out with lawyers all the time, right? You know, we both could have dances with lawyers in our job titles. And lawyers understandably look at laws, look at the bodies that pass laws, and look at that as a main pathway to change. Part of what I found hope for in writing this book were movements that have had success without getting anywhere on the legal side of things. One is looking at the gun control movement, and particularly the survivors of the Marjory Stoneman Douglas shootings. And we had this remarkable example of these kids who've just been traumatized by losing fellow classmates, going to the Florida legislature and saying, can we pass sensible gun control? And the legislature not only doesn't meet with them, but actually passes a bill to have stronger regulations on pornography, concluding that pornography is the problem facing Florida youth, not guns in the schools. And so many of those kids start getting active with institutions they actually feel more able to change. And they start pressuring sporting goods stores, and Dick's Sporting Goods stops selling semi-automatic weapons. Walmart stops carrying most ammunition on the shelves. You actually see changes that are quite dramatic by playing with a different set of levers. I feel like Me Too does this as well. There are fortunately decent laws on the books that prevent sexual assault and sexual harassment. They do not stop sexual assault and sexual harassment from happening in the workplace. That's a norms change. That has everything to do with victims feeling like they should speak out and they can organize and they can move forward with it. And we're starting to see those norms change through public campaigns that are supporting and recognizing and listening rather than silencing people who are experiencing these things. So my take on this is absolutely fight to make Congress less awful, fight gerrymandering, fight all of those good fights, and buy the books by really smart people who are thinking about what those policy interventions there. If you find that that is not a way that you feel like you can make a lot of change, there's a whole lot of alternate pathways to change. And those can be remarkable and profound. Another example that's gotten very complicated in the last couple of weeks, I talk about my friend Moxie Marlinspike, who wants to fight against government surveillance by writing the encryption behind the messaging system Signal. And for some long chunk of time, WhatsApp incorporates Signal's code, and suddenly you have 2 billion people around the globe who are communicating via encryption. This now gets really complicated when some of those people are the neo-Nazis who are trying to invade the Capitol. But this is a way that change can happen that we're not used to thinking about. We're used to thinking about how do we have a debate in Congress over secrecy, over privacy. And in fact, you can have a programmer come in and by manipulating that lever of technology, simply change the entire equation. So the book is essentially a plea to sort of understand that people have more power than they think in some cases, and that exerting that power requires understanding what systems make you powerful and what systems disempower you. And that people who are not well represented in legislative institutions, those systems can end up being really disempowering, and that there are ways in which people can find their power using other tools of change.
I like that thinking of systems that make you powerful and systems that disempower you. That's great. We have a lot of good audience questions, so I want to turn to some of those in the time we have left. Enrique Armijo, hi Enrique. He asks, how do you design interventions in the information market that can address the issue while preserving what's good and useful about mistrust?
Yeah, so mistrust is not something we want to abandon, right? Mistrust is the fuel for scholarly inquiry. It's the fuel for picking something apart and making sure that we're not taking things entirely at face value. At the same time, if we are sort of ruled by mistrust, if we're skeptical of everything we encounter, it's very hard to delegate power. It's very hard to work together on something because we're always afraid of sort of giving things over to those institutions. I think in many ways, what we actually need is to find institutions that we are comfortable being part of. I think people are actually quite desperate for systems that they can become a part of. I think in many ways that was part of the movement behind blogging and citizen media and sort of all sorts of people saying, well, maybe I don't trust the media, but maybe by becoming part of this process, I can be more trusting, or at least I can channel my skepticism into sort of working together on something. I think we had a really nice example of this around elections recently, where many people who were skeptical of the 2020 elections became poll monitors and discovered that for the most part, polling actually works remarkably well. I think taking that mistrust and sort of channeling into action or using it to support institutions, really high quality media, investigative reporting, civil rights organizations that are sort of looking to expose things, great projects like the Markup that are sort of trying to figure out what's not working within technological institutions. I think finding ways to become part of those projects is a great way to figure out how to channel mistrust.
Thank you. So speaking of the media, so Hannah Covington had a question about mistrust in the press and the role that they can play in American civic life moving forward. So there are new ways of doing reporting and media, and you've talked about some of those, but can we rebuild faith in existing newsrooms and existing institutions?
Yeah, let me actually say something in passing to Kat Townsend, and then go over to Hannah Covington and Babak Fakamzadeh. We see you there, and we'll get to you as well. And I just wanted to say Babak Fakamzadeh because I don't get to see him very much these days, and I'm so glad that he's here on the chat. Kat, yes, tons of books involved with this. I will put up a blog post in the next week or so about some of the books that most influenced me in writing Mistrust, and thank you so much for that. Hannah, the press is just a fascinating question. It is one of the many institutions that has just seen a cratering of trust. What I would say is the press has been under such incredibly fierce attack. And I've started thinking almost in terms of organic and synthetic mistrust. I think when I look at the communities behind Black Lives Matter and defund the police, I think there's an awful lot of organic mistrust in those communities by virtue of a long history of systemic racism. I think when we look at right-wing distrust of media in particular, we have to take in consideration the idea that there's been this active campaign for 20 plus years, essentially saying media has a left-wing bias, we have to create our own independent right-wing media, and don't believe anything that the mainstream ends up saying. I think that campaign has had incredibly challenging effects on how media has tried to do its job. And I think there's been a lot of false balance and false equivalency. I think some of the more outrageous moments where, the response to Charlottesville was to go out and better know a Nazi, which is really not what we need.
We're doing again now in a lot of some of this coverage.
We're not always very good at learning lessons from sort of what we've done here. I think understanding that these questions of trust can't just be informational questions. I've gotten very frustrated with the sort of disinfo movement, like the groups of people who are working to expose mis and disinformation, not because it's not filled with smart people. And some of my best friends fight mis and disinfo. This isn't purely an information problem. There are active campaigns to get us to mistrust chunks of reality. The former president ran a disinformation campaign to try to hold on to his office. 70% of Republican voters believe that disinformation campaign. 147 elected federal Republican representatives supported the overturning of the election. That's not just information, that's power. And you have to look at the power equation that's going on with media as well. It's not just that media is getting things wrong. Sometimes that's what's going on, but there's real power being asserted here, and we need to think about consequences for that power. When people are actively promoting disinformation, how do we socially sanction that? How do we respond to that and sort of say, that's not just your opinion, that's actually unacceptable. You're creating a state in which we become increasingly ungovernable, where we have an incredibly hard time keeping a democracy alive and afloat.
That's great. Did you want to get to Babak's questions now? I'm
Yeah,
not
Bob
sure
has got
everyone
a
can
couple.
see our Q&A box, so you might want to
Yeah.
recap whatever question you're going to answer.
Um, so let's see. I mean, the question that I took from Babak that I thought was so interesting was, what's the line between insurrectionism and terrorism? And I think what I would say is terrorism involves violence, right? And I think once you add violence and use the phrase violent insurrectionism, you're talking about something different. I think this is what's so challenging about this situation. People are talking about what happened on January 6th as sedition, as trying to violently overthrow a government. And I agree. I think that's a deeply concerning way to go. I don't think violence has its place within a democracy. I do think, however, that we need to have the capability of looking and saying, this institution just doesn't work anymore. And we should carefully examine how it's failed. And we should think about, can we actually bring it back to its purpose? Or do we need an entirely different institution in its place? And I don't actually think it's a subtle distinction. I think once you're picking up guns and hurting people as a way to win your argument, you're pretty firmly on one side of the line than the other. What I worry about, and I worry about this enormously coming out of Jan 6th, is that this notion that there are institutions that are not working well and that need really careful reexamination and possibly need different institutions instead. I worry that we take that off the table. And I particularly worry about it from the left. I think, like almost everybody else, I'm exhausted by the Trump presidency. I would kill for a few months of normalcy. But normalcy is not enough, actually. Things were pretty normal under Obama, and we had a left-leaning leader who we liked a good deal, and we had the Occupy movement under Obama, and we had the Occupy movement because people were realizing that the systems that we have in place are perpetuating really deep structural inequality, and that no one on the left or the right really seems to be fixing those things. I'm not looking for sleepy normalcy. I actually think getting back to that question of, why did Occupy start? Why, does Black Lives Matter and defund the police? Why do they have such an incredibly compelling case for change? And how do we make sure that those changes actually happen? I think that's where we need to get ourselves.
Thank you. So there's a question, Melanie Bumpus has asked a question that I think relates to that answer. And also there's some case studies that are directly on point in your book.
Yep.
This question of, what would you say to someone who has already been trying to work inside public institutions and become disillusioned, not just with dysfunction, but with their integrity and independence?
Yeah, so I look very much at sort of people who've decided to go inside. And one of the chapters actually starts with my friend Jen Paulka, who I admire enormously. She's the founder of Code for America. She's basically been a Pied Piper trying to get tech people in and involved with the government to try to make systems better. And Jen is fond of saying, ignore politics, like that's the surface of the water. The stuff that I care about is, 30,000 feet down. It's the bureaucracy, it's the systems that sort of go all the way down. But at the end of the chapter, I also talk about someone else who has been trying to be a coder effective in government, who ends up saying, look, I was willing to run into the burning house, and then I figured out that the Trump administration was trying to burn the house down. And I think that's maybe the decision that people have to make. I think the question is an institution capable of reform? Is an institution realistically capable of bringing itself back to its values, of having the impacts that it needs to have? Is the institution fit for purpose? Has the world changed from when the institution was put into place? The Electoral College is probably an example of an institution that doesn't make a ton of sense for the contemporary world right now. We can do vast democratic polling and have pretty good turnaround on it, and a popular vote may simply make more sense at this point. I think efficacy is the lever that I'd like people to think about. If you are not efficacious from within an institution, um, and changing that institution matters to you, then maybe the question becomes, can you be more effective as an outside critic? Can you be more effective in trying to sort of create those alternative institutions and sort of moving down that pathway? You're silent, Katie.
Sorry. We're almost out of time, but I had one question that I wanted to get in before the end. I don't know if people want to stick around for a few minutes. We do have a lot of these questions. But
Sure.
where does a brand new insurrectionist start? You know, if someone reads your book and they're fired up and ready to go, where do you send them?
Yeah. So I think the good news is that there are a lot of citizen-led movements that are trying really hard to bring public pressure around critical issues, whether it's ending sexual harassment, whether it's tackling structural racism, whether it's climate change. I think there's a lot of solidarity out there and a lot of people potentially to work with. I think the key is to use efficacy as the lever and to sort of say, what are you personally good at doing? Are you someone who is more effective at persuading and sort of spreading the word? And that's something that makes a case for norms-based social change through social media advocacy. Are you someone who wants to build and create and sort of try to have change that way? There's potentially, I think, a really good argument for change through markets or change through technology. I just came out of 9 years at the MIT Media Lab. I think my students there saw technology as their most likely lever to make change in one fashion or another. So part of my hope in the book is that there's enough case studies out there that people either see them as sort of parallel to their situation or sometimes really inspiring projects that they can find a way to get into. I think the main message that I want to say is that there isn't necessarily a right way to do this. I think there are wrong ways to do this. I think if you're storming the Capitol while wearing horns in your head, that's pretty firmly a wrong way to be doing this. But there's many, many, many different right ways to do this. And the right way to do this is in a way where you feel like your energies and talents are actually being used and where you feel like you're making a challenge that you believe. And the main thing that I want to say to people is, if you're going to go join the Biden administration, like that's okay. Like you don't have to believe that that's the main way to have change these days, but it also doesn't let you off the hook and sort of say, okay, I'm out of the business of social change for the moment. The question becomes, how do you personally find your efficacy?
Great. Well, I know we're at time, but if you'd like, I'm happy to stick around. We've got a lot of great questions in the queue, but I don't
Yeah,
know what your
absolutely.
schedule's
Well,
like.
well, look, let me just thank everybody who showed up for this. I am so grateful to the people that I know really well and the people that I don't know at all, for showing up. And I would love to acknowledge everyone. There's no possible way to do it, but thank you all so much. And I really love seeing your names here. And I hope you'll hit me up over Twitter or other things. Please, everyone, feel free to log off if you need to be other places. But Katie, yeah, let's take 10 more minutes and then
Okay.
I'm going to pull out at 1:40 and go to the next one of these things.
All right, let's do it. So Stephen Hill wants to know what digital public infrastructure is.
Yeah, so Stephen, digital public infrastructure is what I'm working on now. I'm actually working on it with Katy. I'm working at the Knight First Amendment Institute. Digital public infrastructure is me trying to eat my own dog food. So I went through this process of writing this book. I asked myself this question: am I institutionalist? Am I insurrectionist? Where would I be most effective? And what I ended up feeling was I can be most effective by trying to change how the internet, and particularly the social internet, works. I worked for a company that was one of the real pioneers in user-generated content. It was one of the first social sites on the web. And I was also very involved with the ad-supported model of the web that I think is so broken at this point. So digital public infrastructure is this idea that we should be building an internet not necessarily around commercial profitability, but around systems that are good for us as citizens and as neighbors. And so the idea is to create something similar to a corporation for public broadcasting, some sort of a research and funding institution, possibly funded by taxes on the big internet providers at this point, that tries to create healthy spaces for us to interact online. And I'm working with a lot of other people, like the folks behind Civic Signals, who are sort of thinking about what public spaces look like. I'm doing a lot of work on what healthy social media spaces could look like. And I'm trying not to build the next Facebook. I'm actually trying to build tiny, like 20 to 20,000 person communities that are governed by the people who take part in them, because I think self-governance is probably a critical piece of this. So digital public infrastructure is sort of my blanket term for an internet that works for social and public good, not just purely for profit. But the way that it ties into mistrust is mistrust convinced me that that was how I could be effective. And I guess I'm hoping that for other people, it might help them with this path of where could they uniquely, individually find a way to be effective.
Great.
Larry's got a question of Russia. Russia, this notion of sowing distrust in democracies. And I just think that's so helpful to point out. And maybe getting back to Kat Townsend's part in this, the folks that helped me the most in writing this book were Russia scholars. So Masha Gessen, Peter Pomerantsev, Anne Applebaum, these really brilliant commentators on the former Soviet Union, because I think this notion of weaponized mistrust is really hard to get your head around. I think we've got the organic mistrust that's simply been developing in the United States for a long time. We have synthetic mistrust that comes out of Reagan and Thatcher and sort of neoliberalism, the state can do no good. And now we have this sort of weaponized mistrust, like, don't trust anyone, just trust me. And you see it in Fox News, you see it in spades with Trump. And that comes from Putin. That is a conscious strategy that sort of says the world is full of lies. Everybody has their own agenda. The truth is unknowable. And on top of this confusing sea, look for the person who manages to hold power. And it's worked very well for Putin for a very, very long time. You can see ways in which Trump tried to ride the same train. It's a horrifically disempowering way to look at the world. And Pomerantsev wrote a book called Nothing is Real and Everything is Possible, which I just adored, and ended up basically just stalking Peter until he became my friend. But he was talking about the fact that his Russian friends, sort of the cool way to be is not to believe anything, because only a fool would believe anything. The reality is unknowable and it's uninfluenceable. And it's hard to imagine a more disempowering reality than that one. And so one of the things that I try to think about in the book is there a danger that at a certain point mistrust starts eroding reality? And when I started writing that chapter, maybe 2 years ago, I felt like I was way, way out on a limb. But we've had the events of this last month that suggest that reality is actually surprisingly fragile. And I think looking at this Russian style of disinformatia is actually enormously important for sort of understanding this moment. Namrata has this great question about how does the government work towards rejuvenating public trust? And I think that's actually really important to talk about. I spend the second chapter of the book trying to figure out what happened to trust. And I turned this chapter into my publisher and it was 19,000 words long. And he just said, no, I'm sorry. I understand you're an academic. Book chapters in my world are 7,000 to 9,000 words, just slim it down. And what that chapter now says is, look, there's a lot of theories for what brings about mistrust. Maybe we have a better educated population who's in a better position to ask questions. Maybe we have a more open information environment. Maybe it is, as I said, it's racism. It's people essentially saying my class is no longer privileged, therefore I no longer trust the system. Maybe it's inequality. Inequality has been on a tremendous rise since the 1960s. Maybe we're simply not doing very well and therefore we're mistrustful of systems. The explanation that I find the most convincing is that people lose mistrust when systems fail them. And you can find this with a lot of the examples of loss of trust. People trust the church until the Catholic Church sex abuse scandal, and suddenly there's an enormous drop in trust. People trust the medical system until the advent of HMOs, and suddenly people aren't dealing with their family doctor anymore. They're dealing with a vast bureaucracy that exists in part to prevent them from getting healthcare. And trust drops within that system. I think governments gain trust in particular by figuring out where they failed and genuinely changing those systems. I think that the reason that Taiwan is starting to enjoy the trust of its citizens is that it actually found those places where it is failing in very, very serious ways, and then sort of finding a way to make the change. So yeah, that's my hope. Now that I realize that feels like really weak tea, but it's not in some ways. Actually trying to figure out how you fix a problem, and then going about actually fixing it is one of the hardest things to do within big institutions. Let me see if we can go to perhaps Tunde for sort of the last question, which is mistrust in science. I think this is a form of mistrust that's really quite terrifying. I think of the different movements that I'm sort of trying to understand, the anti-vax movement is one of the ones that I am most trying to understand. I don't think mistrust in science sort of starts with, oh no, get those equations away from me. I actually think it has to do with questioning people's agendas. I've done some work within the anti-vax movement, and what it really is in many cases is an anti-corporate movement. It's people who are worried about big pharma, they're worried about profit motives, and that translates into acceptance of narratives in which vaccines are dangerous and which they're being pushed upon us. There's an assumption that anti-vaxxers are anti-science. We've actually sort of found the contrary in our research. We've looked at media that's very popular with anti-vaxxers. And actually, there's a lot of anti-vaxxers who are reading scientific papers. They're just reading them through a very narrow and agendaed lens, essentially looking for the research that's going to help them out. I think at the end of the day, mistrust often has to do with motives. People look at something and say, I don't believe this because I think I understand the motives behind it and I disagree with the motives. I don't think the planet can be warming because I don't like the policy implications of sort of where it's going. How do you combat this? I think some of it is exactly what I was saying to the previous questioner, which is looking for the ways in which those institutions have lost confidence in the first place. And I do think there are places where big business has perfectly legitimate ways that it's lost confidence. Whether that solves, the anti-vax situation, that's a big lift at this point. But actually finding functional institutions is one of the most powerful things that we can do.
That's great. I think that's a good place to end. Thanks everyone for joining us. Thank you, Ethan, for doing this. In the chat box, there is a link to take you to buy his book and also to subscribe to the Knight Institute's newsletter. Ethan, thank you so much. This was wonderful, and it's really an excellent book. Congratulations on such a great piece of work.
I really appreciate it. Thanks to everyone at the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia. Thanks to everyone who signed on to this. Please follow up with me on Twitter if I didn't get to you, @EthanZ. And thank you all so much. Cheers.
Bye, everyone.